Chapter 17. Loss. Tamara Imanov. That was her full name. Everyone was sure there'd be repercussions, that the girl would be punished in some way for standing up to the general. But the days passed and nothing happened. Tamara was quite pretty, but her attractiveness was not entirely a consequence of her features. After what had happened at the inspection, I saw a very loving, strong, and good human being. Nothing is more alluring than a girl like that. I had a crush on her, as did many others in the ward. One day she came and took my temperature and pulse. "Your temperature is fine," she said, "but your pulse is racing." "I know," I said. I looked at where her hand was touching my wrist. She blushed with understanding. "And why is your pulse racing?" "Because of you," I said, afraid that I had been too bold. I smiled nervously. Our eyes met. She gently patted my hand, and then she was gone. Early one morning I noticed Tamara peeking out the window not far from where my bed was situated. She did this over and over. It was nearly our lunchtime when suddenly her eyes lit up. Across the way were the stable and the abandoned dry goods shop, and coming down the alley between the buildings was a young soldier, handsome, dark-haired, and unusually tall. He stood waiting in the alley when, from a side door of the hospital, Tamara suddenly emerged. She hurried across the road to the alley, where she and the soldier embraced. He gave her a blue scarf. They kissed, then holding hands, walked down the street and disappeared from sight. "Her boyfriend," said the boy across the way. "Marusia's prettier," said another patient. He made a face. "But she's got a boyfriend too, probably a dozen of them." I looked to where Tamara and her boyfriend had kissed. A sinking feeling inside. I frowned and looked away. At this point, I had been in the hospital more than 2 weeks. Except for my abdominal wound, I felt pretty well. Though the tube was still in my side, very little of the pink gunk was coming out of me. I could sit up and even eat some solid food. My knee and head hardly bothered me at all. Since coming to Alreni, supply trucks and other vehicles brought more wounded to the schoolhouse hospital on a fairly regular basis. They suddenly stopped coming. The reason, we learned, was that the Germans had retaken a large area of western Russia, and this had cut off all transport into Alreni. Now the hospital was running out of almost everything, and the patients began to suffer. At the same time, because there were fewer cases, we began to see more of our doctors and skilled nurses. Freed from doing almost non-stop surgery, they finally had more time to visit the wards. I was awakened one afternoon to find Dr. Sworoff and a pudgy moon-faced surgical nurse hovering near me. "How are you feeling, boy?" asked Sworoff. Due to the shortages, the dressings around my belly hadn't been changed in some time. The thing was sticky and crusty, and I'd been feeling nauseous off and on all day. I was about to tell him how miserable I felt, but then Tamara came over, and to Sworoff's question I simply answered that I was fine. I wasn't about to whine like a little boy in front of her. On Sworoff's instructions, she removed the bandage from my head. Then the chubby surgical nurse plucked the stitches from my scalp. Sworoff apologized. He and Rostovic had been so busy in the operating room that the sutures had been left in too long, he explained, and the wound had healed over to an extent that they were difficult to remove. It took quite a tug to get some of them out, and it felt like my scalp was being pulled apart. I clenched my jaw and tried not to let myself as much as flinch. "I hope I'm not hurting you," said the stout nurse. "Niet," I said. My eyes were on Tamara and the blue scarf around her neck, the one from her boyfriend. Sworoff threw back the thin sheet, cut away the crusty bandaging around my abdomen, and began examining me. "The wound is healing nicely," he declared, "but this," he told the nurse as he held up the red rubber tube, "should have been removed days ago." 2 strong, practiced fingers passed down on either side of the tube. "We're out of local anesthetics," he told me. "I'm afraid this will hurt." He began to pull. I closed my eyes against the pain. It felt as though a snake was wiggling around inside my gut. Suddenly it slithered wetly from the hole. I opened my eyes and, panting, lay back as Sworoff stitched the opening closed. without anesthetic. Sweat broke out on my forehead. Tamara patted it away with a cool cloth. "You are very brave," she said in her soothing voice. I pursed my lips into something near a smile. An orderly cut off the cast on my leg. "It looks good," he said as he examined my knee. After touching it all over and asking where it was tender, he slowly bent the knee, testing the flexibility. At first it felt as though my knee was going to snap in half, but as Swaroff continued, the pain ebbed. "Bed rest today," he told Tamara. "Then I want him walking with support." "Yes, doctor." Tamara and the other nurse rolled me onto my stomach so that Swaroff could work on the bullet's exit wound in my back. I let out a cry, not of pain, but of indignation. My rear end was exposed. Tamara must have seen hundreds of soldiers' backsides before, but it didn't matter, not to me. Furious and embarrassed, I quickly covered myself. The pudgy nurse laughed. Tamara apologized. Me, I lay there on my stomach, mortified, as Swaroff removed the stitches from my back. "You'll be up and about in no time," he told me, then left Tamara and the moon-faced nurse to rebandage me. Lying face down, I couldn't see the two as they worked, but I could tell the difference very clearly between Tamara's gentle touch and that of the other woman, whose fingers were like fat, stumpy sausages. Finally, I was rolled onto my back again, and the two left. I hurt, but I was glad to finally have the cast and tube gone. My mind was drifting when a drone of voices caught my attention. I turned to find Dr. Rostovich, a thermometer in hand, and Katerina at his side, talking to my friend Nikolai. "You have a fever," said Rostovich in his nervous, annoying voice. Nikolai shrugged. "Do you suffer from headaches?" "Sometimes." "And night sweats?" continued Dr. Rostovich. "Do you sweat a lot, particularly at night?" Nikolai nodded, at the same time shrugging it off again as being of no importance. Rostovich, a worried expression on his twitchy face, looked at Nikolai's chart. 4 days without antibiotics, he muttered to Katerina. He gave her a knowing look, then pulled back Nikolai's sheets. Peering closely at the pants-like cast, he began pressing down on the plaster, which had a spongy, sort of soggy look about it. "Does it hurt there?" Nikolai Rostovich asked as he pushed down fairly hard on one spot. "Yes, a little bit, doctor," replied Nikolai. "And there?" Rostovich's hands had moved to another area. "No, doctor. How about there?" "No, not at all." Rostovich turned to Katerina and said something to her, and she hurried off, returning a few minutes later with 2 orderlies. On the doctor's instructions, they began cutting away at the huge cast. Almost immediately, a putrid stench arose, and I didn't need to be a doctor to see that both of Nikolai's legs were badly infected. From mid-thigh down, they were swollen, and streaked with black. "Gaseous gangrene," said the doctor. Nikolai pushed himself to a sitting position and stared down at his legs in horror and disbelief. "But they hardly hurt at all." "That's sometimes the case." Rostovich took a safety pin from his lapel, then jabbed Nikolai's legs, gently at first, then harder. Nikolai just watched. "I don't feel it." "The nerves, undoubtedly, are all but dead," Rostovich said, as he continued jabbing Nikolai's legs and feet with the pin. He looked at Katerina. "This is what happens as a result of not having a full regimen of antibiotics." "What is wrong with my legs?" demanded Nikolai. "They are badly infected, comrade." All the color drained from Nikolai's face. "But I was sure they were getting better." He lay back heavily. Mikos looked around from his bed at Nikolai, his forehead wrinkled up into a tight frown. "We'll have to take them off," said Rostovich, "in order to save your life. And even then, we may not be able to stop the—" "Both my legs?" Nikolai stared wide-eyed at the ceiling. "Yes, I'm afraid so." "No, doctor," cried Nikolai. "What will I do without my legs? I have a wife and children. I must take care of my family. I must work." "I'm sorry, comrade," said the doctor. The operation was done that night. When Nikolai returned to his bed, there were only stumps beneath the blanket. In the morning, I awoke to hear him crying softly to himself. He would not speak to me, Mikos, or Boris, not to anyone. That afternoon, Tamara and an orderly helped me from my bed. Between the two, with my arms around their shoulders, I walked almost the entire length of the ward. I was a bit lightheaded. My belly cramped up on me a bit. My knee felt weak, but it really hurt very little. All in all, I felt quite good, and walking with one arm around Tamara provided the pleasant illusion that she was my girl. But in another way I felt horrid. As I walked, Nikolai's eyes were on me. I knew what he must be thinking, and I felt sick with guilt. When I returned to bed, I averted my gaze from my legless friend. I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, an ugly parade of thoughts going around in my head. The sun went down, the room began to darken. Around the ward, kerosene lamps were lit, turning the place to a soft mix of yellows, grays, and blacks. Surprising me, I felt a hand. Nikolai's touch. Nikolai's touch mine. "It's all right, son," he said in a faint voice. "I'll make it." I blinked at tears in my eyes. We did not look at each other. We simply lay there in the dark. He clasped my hand tightly and said good night.